Eleanor Hayes did not cry when they laughed at her blankets. She did not cry when Mrs. Hargrove kicked the stack off the table and let them fall into the summer dust. She had not cried in 3 years. She picked them up one by one, her hands steady, her jaw set, and she told herself the same thing she told herself every morning. Keep moving. Nobody is coming. Then boots stopped in front of her, heavy, unhurried, and a voice said, "How much for all of them?" If this story already has your heart, subscribe and come along for the whole ride. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story travels. The morning Eleanor Hayes set up her blanket display in front of Callaway's general store, the temperature in Red Hollow, Colorado, was already climbing past 90 degrees. Summer in this part of the territory did not ease into itself. It arrived like a punishment, sudden, relentless, the kind of heat that made the mountains shimmer at the edges and turned the dirt roads to powder under a horse's hooves. Eleanor had been awake since 4. She had stitched the final border on her last blanket by candlelight, her fingers moving from pure habit, her eyes burning from the hours. She had 7 blankets in total. Each one took her between 5 and 7 days to complete, depending on the pattern. She used whatever fabric she could trade for, beg for, or salvage from the remnants bin at Whitmore's Dry Goods, because Harlan Whitmore charged half price for the scraps nobody else wanted, and Eleanor Hayes could not afford to be proud about that. She had laid them out carefully on the wooden table she borrowed from old Pete, the retired blacksmith who lived 2 doors down and never asked her for anything in return. 7 blankets. 43 days of work. She had priced them each at 60 cents. It was not enough to carry her through August. She had known that going in, but it was a start, and Eleanor Hayes had learned to treat starts with something close to reverence, because she knew better than most people how quickly even a start could be taken away. She stood behind the table and waited. Red Hollow was not a large town. Maybe 400 souls if you counted the families spread across the surrounding ranch land. The main street ran north to south, 2 rows of storefronts facing each other across 50 feet of dust and horse traffic, and by 7 in the morning it was already beginning to fill. Cowboys heading to the feed store. Women in their good summer dresses moving toward the church hall for whatever organizing women in Red Hollow were always organizing. Children running in packs, half of them barefoot. Nobody stopped at Eleanor's table. That was not unusual. What was unusual was the way people did not stop. They did not drift past and fail to notice her. They looked. Several of them looked directly at her and then looked away again, quickly, deliberately, the way you looked away from something that made you uncomfortable. Eleanor had grown used to it. She kept her chin level and her hands folded in front of her, and she waited. It was close to 8 o'clock when Margaret Hargrove arrived. Margaret Hargrove was the wife of Douglas Hargrove, who owned the largest dry goods operation in the county and sat on the town council, and had on 3 separate occasions in the last 2 years blocked Eleanor's application for a permanent vendor's permit on the grounds that her operation lacked sufficient establishment. Eleanor did not know exactly what that meant. She suspected it meant that Margaret Hargrove did not like the look of her. Margaret stopped in front of the blanket table. She had 2 women with her, Sarah Colton and Ruth Beale, both of them wives of men with money, both of them wearing expressions that Eleanor had learned to recognize. It was the expression women wore when they had already decided something and were only stopping to confirm it. "My goodness," Margaret said. She reached out and lifted the corner of the nearest blanket between 2 fingers, the way you might lift something questionable off the floor. "Did you make these yourself?" "Yes, ma'am," Eleanor said. Margaret let it drop. "The stitching is uneven." "It's not," Eleanor said. The words came out before she could stop them. She had meant to say thank you for looking, or I appreciate your time, or nothing at all. But the stitching was not uneven. She had spent 3 hours on the border of that particular blanket alone, and she knew it was not uneven. Margaret's eyes sharpened. "Excuse me. The stitching is even," Eleanor said. Her voice stayed steady. She did not know how. "You're welcome to look more closely if you'd like." Sarah Colton made a small sound, not quite a laugh, but close enough. Margaret set the blanket down. She looked at Eleanor for a moment with an expression that was almost curious, the way a woman looked at something she had underestimated and was recalculating. 60 cents, Margaret said, reading the tag. For a scrap blanket. They're not scrap blankets, Eleanor said. They're made from mill remnants, yes, but the construction is solid. They'll last. Who would buy these, people who need blankets? At 60 cents. Yes, ma'am. Margaret Hargrove smiled. It was not a kind smile. Eleanor, she said, and she said the name the way certain women said it, like she was doing Eleanor a favor by using it. I think you'd do better to find yourself some honest employment. Clara Beeson is looking for a laundress. That might suit you better than this. Eleanor did not answer. She had learned through considerable trial and considerable pain that there were moments when not answering was the only kind of dignity available to a woman in her position. She looked at the blankets on the table. She kept her hands still. Margaret gave a small nod as if Eleanor's silence confirmed something. She turned to go, and then she knocked the stack off the table on old maid. It might have been an accident. Eleanor would never know for certain. The stack was at the edge, and Margaret's skirt was wide, and it could have been nothing more than carelessness. But it did not feel like carelessness. It felt like the period at the end of a sentence Margaret had already been writing. 7 blankets hit the summer dust of Red Hollow's main street. For a moment nobody moved. Eleanor looked at her blankets' 43 days of work, all of it on the ground, the cream-colored border of the one she was most proud of, already showing a smear of horse traffic. Brown. And she felt something inside her go very quiet. Not defeated. Not that. Something older than defeat. Something that had been through defeat so many times it had stopped taking it personally. She walked around the table. She bent down and picked up the first blanket. Oh my, Sarah Colton said behind her hand. She's actually going to pick them up. What else would she do? Ruth Beale said, and she did not lower her voice. Eleanor did not answer. She shook the dust from the first blanket. She folded it. She reached for the second. You know what your problem is, Margaret said from behind her. You have no sense of where you belong. Your mother was the same way, always reaching above her station. It's not becoming Eleanor. It never was. Eleanor froze, just for a second, just long enough for her hands to stop moving. Her mother had died 6 years ago. She had died in a one-room house on the edge of town, with nothing to her name and nobody to come. Eleanor had buried her herself because there was nobody else to do it. And she had told herself afterward that she was going to build something, anything that her mother would have been proud of. Some small proof that the reaching was worth it. That it had not been foolishness or vanity or a lack of sense of where she belonged. 7 blankets in the summer dust was what she had to show for it. She picked up the third blanket. Then boots stopped in front of her. Heavy, deliberate. The boots of a man who walked like he was not in a hurry and did not need to be. Eleanor looked up. She had seen Caleb Dawson before. Everyone in Red Hollow had seen Caleb Dawson before. In the way you saw a mountain, you were aware of it. You took note of its dimensions, and then you moved on because it was not the sort of thing that invited approach. He ran a cattle operation up in the high country 15 miles north of town. He came in maybe once a month for supplies. He did not linger, he did not socialize. He tipped his hat, and he conducted his business, and he left. He was standing in front of her now, looking at the blankets on the ground, and then at Eleanor. And then he said, "How much for all of them?" Eleanor straightened slowly. "All of them." 7 blankets, he said. "What's the price?" She looked at him. He was maybe 38, she guessed, with the kind of face that didn't bother hiding what it had been through. Dark hair, a few days of growth on his jaw, eyes the color of the mountains behind him when the light went flat in the afternoon. 60 cents each, she said. That's $4.20 for the lot. He reached into his vest and counted out the coins without hesitating and set them on the table with one hand while he bent down with the other and picked up the 4 blankets still on the ground. He did it so efficiently, so matter-of-factly, that it took Eleanor a moment to realize what had happened. Caleb Dawson. Margaret said behind him. Her voice had shifted. People who had money knew how to shift their voices for people who had more. I wouldn't have thought you were in the market for blankets. Caleb straightened with the blankets tucked under one arm. He looked at Margaret Hargrove with an expression that Eleanor could not entirely read. Not hostile, not warm. Something in between. Something level. I've got hands on the ranch, he said. They need blankets same as anyone. He turned to Eleanor. Miss Hayes, she said. Eleanor Hayes. Miss Hayes. He set the stack down on her table and held out his hand. Eleanor shook it without thinking about it. Caleb Dawson. Do you deliver, or should I send someone? I can arrange delivery, she said. She had never delivered anything in her life. She had no horse and no cart, and no way to get 15 miles up into the mountains. But she said it anyway, because it was either that or she lost the sale, and she could not afford to lose the sale. Good, he said. He picked up the stack of blankets again. I'll send one of my men tomorrow morning. Tell him the address. He turned to leave. Then he stopped. He did not turn fully back around. He stood with his back half to her, and his voice went quiet in a way that still carried. Your stitching is even, he said. He tipped his hat and walked to his horse. The street was very quiet. Eleanor looked at the coins on her table. $4.20. More money than she had held in her hand at one time in 3 months. She looked up at Margaret Hargrove. Margaret had gone a particular shade of color that had nothing to do with the heat. Well, Margaret said. And then she did not say anything else. She turned and walked away, and Sarah and Ruth went with her, and the little audience that had gathered on the edge of things began to drift apart, and Eleanor was left standing at her table in the summer morning with $4.20 and 7 fewer blankets, and a feeling in her chest she did not entirely know what to do with. She sat down in the chair behind the table. Old Pete came out from 2 doors down, a mug of coffee in each hand, and set one in front of her without asking if she wanted it. Well, he said, sitting down in the second chair he had carried out for himself. That was something. He probably just needed blankets, Eleanor said. Probably. She wrapped her hands around the mug. The coffee was strong and a little burnt, and it tasted like the best thing she had had in a week. He didn't have to say that, she said. About the stitching. No. Pete agreed. He didn't. She did not say anything else about it, but she did not forget it. The man who came to her door the next morning was maybe 20 years old, with a sunburned neck and a cart that had seen better decades. He introduced himself as Will Ranch Hand to Caleb Dawson, and he had brought her blankets, all 7 of them, in the cart as promised. She had expected it to be a one-time transaction. It was not. 3 days later, Will came back. Mr. Dawson wants to know if you take orders, he said, hat in hand, doing his level best to look like he delivered this kind of message all the time. Eleanor stared at him. Orders, she said. Yes, ma'am. Specific blankets. He's got some particular ideas about... Will seemed to lose the thread of what he'd been instructed to say. He wrote it down. He produced a folded piece of paper from his shirt pocket. Eleanor took it. The handwriting was plain, almost careful. The handwriting of a man who did not write often and wanted to be clearly understood. 4 blankets. Heavier weight. Dark colors. If you've got something in blue or green, those will do. And here is payment in advance. There was money folded inside the paper. More than the blankets would cost. She looked up at Will. This is too much, she said. He said you might say that, Will said. He said to tell you it accounts for your labor time, not just the materials. She stood in the doorway, holding the note and the money, and she did not know what to make of Caleb Dawson of the High Country Cattle Operation, and his very specific opinions about blanket colors, and his very precise understanding of what labor time was worth. Tell him I'll have them ready in 3 weeks, she said. Yes, ma'am. Will climbed back onto his cart. Then he looked back at her with the easy honesty of a young man who hadn't yet learned to be strategic about what he said. "He's a good man, Mr. Dawson," Will said, "in case that matters." She watched him drive away. She unfolded the note again and read it once more. "If you've got something in blue or green, those will do." She went inside and looked through her fabric remnants and found a piece of mountain blue wool she had been saving for something she hadn't yet decided on, and she decided on it now. She had the 4 blankets done in 2.5 weeks. She told herself it was because she had more time than usual, which was true, but only barely. The real reason was that she had started early every morning and worked until the light went, and she had put the mountain blue one in the center of the pile and smoothed it with her palm before wrapping them and tied the whole thing with the best cord she had, which she did not examine too closely. Will came for the blankets on a Tuesday. He counted them and wrapped them into the cart and started to climb up, and then he stopped. "Mr. Dawson wanted me to ask," he said, "if you'd be willing to come up to the ranch sometime, to look at the bunkhouse. He says there are some other things might need attention. Curtains, maybe." He didn't exactly say curtains, but I think that's what he meant. Eleanor stood very still. "He wants me to come to the ranch," she said. "Yes, ma'am. To look at the bunkhouse." "That's what he said?" She thought about Caleb Dawson and his flat-eyed calm in the middle of Red Hollow's main street. She thought about the note. She thought about the way he had bent down in the summer dust and picked up her blankets without making a performance of it. "What day?" she said. "Saturday," Will said. "I'll come and get you." "I have my own feet," Eleanor said. Will blinked. "Ma'am, it's 15 miles. "I know how far it is." Will appeared to think about this. "I'll bring the cart," he said in the tone of a man making a reasonable compromise. "And you can decide when we get there whether you want to call it your feet or my cart." She almost smiled. Almost. "Saturday," she said. "Yes, ma'am." Guide. She had been to the high country only once before years ago with her father, before everything with her father went the way it went. She had forgotten how the air changed as you climbed, how the dry summer heat of the valley gave way to something cooler and cleaner the higher you went, as if the mountains were keeping something in reserve. The ranch was larger than she had imagined. Not grand. It was not a show place, not the kind of operation that was built to impress visitors. It was a working ranch, and everything about it announced that clearly. The barn was big and solid and slightly weathered. The fencing was well maintained. There were horses in the near paddock and cattle visible in the distance against the hillside, and 3 hands moving between the barn and the water tank, busy with the kind of mid-morning work that never quite ended. Caleb Dawson was standing in front of the house when Will's cart pulled up. He looked the same as he had in town. Same hat, same steady stance, same expression that did not give much away. He watched them come in without moving. "Miss Hayes," he said when she climbed down. "Mr. Dawson?" He looked at her for a moment, not in an uncomfortable way, not invasive, just assessing the way a man who lived by observation and practicality looked at things he was trying to understand. "You came," he said. "I said I would." "A lot of people say things," he said. It was not an accusation. It sounded almost like a statement of scientific fact. "I'm not a lot of people," Eleanor said. Something moved in his expression, just briefly. She might have imagined it. "No," he said. "I don't reckon you are." He turned toward the house. "Come in, and I'll show you what needs doing." The bunkhouse needed curtains. She had known it would. Will had been right about that, even if neither of them had wanted to say it plainly. It also needed 2 of its bedrolls replaced, and someone with a steady hand to mend the tiers in the canvas supply bag stacked in the corner, and possibly something done about the shelf that was listing at a 15-degree angle and threatening to deposit its contents onto the floor at the next significant vibration. She had not expected Caleb Dawson to come with her while she assessed all of this. He stood near the door while she moved around the bunkhouse, touching things, measuring with her eye, making small notes on the paper she had brought. He did not hover. He did not follow her too closely, but he was there, and he answered her questions when she asked them, and he did not volunteer information she hadn't asked for. She found that she didn't mind it. "How many hands do you run?" she asked. "8, he said. 6 full-time, 2 seasonal." "Winter blankets for 8 then," she was writing. "And the curtains for these 4 windows. Canvas bags I can do, though some of them need replacing rather than mending the fabrics too far gone to hold a stitch." "Whatever you reckon is right," he said. She looked up at him. He was standing with his arms crossed, not tense, just settled, looking out the window. "You don't negotiate much," she said. "I know what things are worth," he said. "I don't see the point in arguing about it." "Most people in this town would argue about it." "Most people in this town," he said, "don't know what things are worth." She looked at him for a moment. Then she went back to her notes. "I'll have a price for you before I go," she said. "And a timeline." "Take what time you need," he said. "I'm not in a hurry." It was only later riding back down the mountain in Will's cart, with her notes in her lap, and the afternoon sun burning her left shoulder, that Eleanor realized what had been different about the last 3 hours. Caleb Dawson had not once asked her where she came from, had not asked why she was alone, had not asked whether she had family in the area, or a husband, or prospects of any kind, had not offered his opinion on what she should be doing with herself, or complimented her in a way that was really a diminishment in disguise. He had treated her like someone who had come to do a job and was capable of doing it. She had not been treated that way in so long that she had almost forgotten what it felt like. She looked out at the valley below, opening up as they descended Red Hollow's rooftops, emerging from the heat haze small and certain, and entirely indifferent to her. She thought about the mountain blue blanket she had folded into the center of the stack, whether he had noticed which one it was, whether it mattered. She told herself it didn't. But she looked at her hands, the calluses at the base of each finger, the small scar on her right palm where a needle had slipped 2 years ago and gone deep, and she thought, "Keep moving. Nobody is coming." And then, for the first time in 3 years, she wondered if she had been wrong about that. The gossip started the following week. She had expected it. She was a woman in a small town with no money and no family and no position, and Caleb Dawson was a man with land and cattle and whatever quiet authority it was that he carried without seeming to try. That combination was exactly the kind of thing that gave people in Red Hollow something to talk about. What she had not expected was how quickly it turned mean. She was buying thread at Whitmore's Dry Goods when she heard it 2 women in the next aisle over not bothering to lower their voices. "I heard she went up to the Dawson Ranch alone." Alone. Lord. Well, you know what kind of woman does that. You'd think she'd have more shame, chasing after a man with land. She's been making eyes at anyone who might pull her out of that little hole she lives in. You remember how she was with the Whitfield boy. She's her mother's daughter is all. Grace Hayes had no sense of propriety either. Eleanor stood in the dry goods aisle with a spool of cream thread in her hand, and she did not move. She counted to 10. She breathed. She put the thread down. She walked to the front of the store, placed her other items on the counter, and looked at Harlan Whitmore, who had the grace to look briefly uncomfortable. "I heard that," she said quietly. "In case you were wondering." Harlan looked at his counter. "Miss Hayes." "I'd like to complete my purchase," she said. He completed her purchase. She walked out. She made it almost to the end of the street before she had to stop. She stood in the alley between the blacksmith and the feed store out of view, and she put her hand against the wall and she breathed, and she told herself, it did not matter. It did not matter. It had never mattered. She had survived worse than 2 women in a dry goods store. She was still standing there when Boots stopped at the alley entrance. She turned. Caleb Dawson was looking at her. He had a bag of feed in each hand and a coil of rope over one shoulder, and the expression of a man who had not expected to find her here and was deciding what to do about it. "Miss Hayes," he said. "Mr. Dawson." She straightened. She made her voice level. "I'm fine." He set the feed bags down. He did not say, "You don't look fine," and he did not ask her what was wrong, and he did not suggest that she ought to go home and rest. He just stood there for a moment, looking at her the way he had looked at everything steadily without hurry. "There's a bench," he said, "outside the livery. It's around the corner, mostly out of the sun at this time of day." He paused. "You look like you could use somewhere to sit." She considered telling him she was fine again. She considered walking away. She said, "All right." They walked to the livery. There was indeed a bench, old wood smooth from use, tucked under the lip of the overhang, where the afternoon light didn't reach directly. Caleb Dawson set his feed bags down against the wall and sat at one end of the bench, and Eleanor sat at the other, and for a while neither of them said anything. The sounds of Red Hollow moved around them. Cartwheels and hammer strikes and the distant sound of children. "You heard them," she said. It was not a question. "Part of it," he said. She looked straight ahead. "It doesn't matter what they say." "No," he said. "It doesn't." A pause. "Doesn't mean it doesn't sting." She did not answer that. He turned the brim of his hat in his hands slowly once around. It was the first time she had seen him make a gesture that seemed anything less than completely deliberate. "My wife died 4 years ago," he said. "Wagon accident crossing down from the high country in early spring. Ice on the trail." He said it the way you said things you had said to yourself many times until the words were worn smooth from the saying. "The town had opinions about that too. About whether I'd done right by her. About whether I should have gone back to Missouri where I came from." He set the hat back on his head. "People say things. Most of it's about them, not about you." Eleanor thought about her mother. About Grace Hayes had no sense of propriety either. "Did it help?" she said, knowing that... He was quiet for a moment. "Not much," he said, "but it helped enough." She looked at him. He was looking out at the street, his profile sharp against the whitewashed wall of the livery. "I'm sorry about your wife," she said. "I'm sorry about whatever they said in there," he said. They sat in the shade of the livery overhang while Red Hollow went about its business around them, and Eleanor Hayes held her package of thread in her lap and did not cry, not once, and thought about what it meant to have somewhere to sit when you needed it. It was not nothing. In fact, it was the furthest thing from nothing she could imagine. She went home that afternoon, and she did not let herself think about Caleb Dawson for the rest of the evening. She was mostly successful. She lit her lamp, and she spread her fabric remnants across the work table, and she began calculating what she would need for 8 winter blankets and 4 sets of bunkhouse curtains and the canvas bag repairs. She wrote the numbers down. She checked them twice. She kept her hands busy and her mind on the work, because work had always been the thing that held her together when everything else was trying to pull her apart. She had learned that from her mother. Grace Hayes had sewn until the week she died. Curtains for other people's windows, quilts for other people's children, mending for the men at the boarding house on Fern Street. She had never stopped working, even when the work paid almost nothing. Even when the women she sewed for looked right through her at Sunday services and acted as though the curtains had hung themselves. Eleanor had asked her once, she must have been 12, maybe 13, why she kept doing it. Why she kept sewing for people who treated her like she wasn't quite worth the trouble of being seen. Her mother had looked up from whatever she was mending and said very simply, "Because the work is good, Eleanor. The work doesn't care who does it." Eleanor had not fully understood that then. She understood it completely now. She finished her calculations and wrote up a fair price for the Dawson order and folded the paper and set it on the corner of the table where she would remember it. And then she blew out the lamp, and she went to bed, and she did not dream about anything she could remember in the morning. The week that followed was ordinary, which in Eleanor's experience meant it was only moderately difficult. She sold 2 small hand-sewn pouches at the market on Wednesday to a woman passing through on her way to Denver who did not know Eleanor, had no opinion about Eleanor, and simply wanted 2 pouches. It was the easiest transaction Eleanor had made in months, and she was aware of a small, unhappy irony in that the easiest commerce she had was always with strangers. She delivered her price estimate to Will on Thursday when he came into town for supplies. He tucked it into his shirt pocket with the solemn efficiency of a young man who understood he was a link in a chain and took that responsibility seriously. On Friday morning, she was mending a shirt for the barber on 2nd Street when someone knocked on her door. It was not Will. It was Margaret Hargrove. Eleanor stood in her doorway and looked at the woman who had let 7 blankets fall into the summer dust and had invoked her dead mother's name in a dry goods store, and she kept her face absolutely neutral. "Mrs. Hargrove," she said. "Eleanor." Margaret was not wearing her usual expression of polite disdain. She was wearing something more careful, more calculated, the expression of a woman who had come to accomplish something and intended to do it gracefully. "May I come in? I'm working," Eleanor said. "This won't take long." Eleanor stood aside. Margaret came in and looked around the small room, the work table, the fabric stacked against the wall, the lamp, the single window, and she had the discipline not to let what she thought of it show on her face, which Eleanor supposed was a kind of courtesy. "I'll get to the point," Margaret said. "My husband would like to offer you a position." Eleanor waited. "We have need of a seamstress at the dry goods store. Someone to do alterations, custom work, that sort of thing. It would be a steady wage. Indoor work." She paused. "Better than this." She said better than this the way you said it when you wanted to sound generous rather than condescending and you were not quite managing it. "What wage?" Eleanor said. Margaret named a figure. It was less than Eleanor made in a good month on her own. Not by a little. By enough to matter. "No," Eleanor said. Margaret blinked. "Eleanor, it's not enough," Eleanor said. "And I don't want to work in your husband's store, Mrs. Hargrove. I want to run my own." The calculation shifted behind Margaret's eyes. Eleanor could almost see it happening, the reassessment, the recalibration. "Is this about Caleb Dawson?" Margaret said. The question landed like a stone into still water. Eleanor felt the ripples, but kept her face from showing them. "This is about my work," Eleanor said. "It always has been." "He's not going to Eleanor. Whatever you think is happening up at that ranch, you should be careful. Men like Caleb Dawson don't take up with women like—" She stopped. She seemed to catch herself. "Women like what?" Eleanor said. Her voice was very quiet. Margaret Hargrove had been in uncomfortable conversations before. She recovered quickly. "I only mean you should be realistic about your situation," she said. "He's a man of property. He needs a certain kind of— There are certain expectations in this community. I'm going to ask you to leave now," Eleanor said. "Eleanor." "Thank you for coming, Mrs. Hargrove. I'll show you out." Margaret left. Eleanor closed the door and stood with her back against it for a moment, and breathed. She was shaking. She didn't want to be shaking. She pressed her hands flat against the door behind her and waited until they stopped. Men like Caleb Dawson don't take up with women like— Women like what? She knew what. She had always known what. Women who had nothing. Women who had come from nothing. Women whose mothers had sewn curtains for people who looked right through them. She went back to the barber's shirt. She picked up her needle. She made the first stitch. The work doesn't care who does it. She made the second. By the time she reached the third, her hands were steady again. Will came back Saturday morning with Caleb Dawson's response to her price estimate. She unfolded the note, expecting a counteroffer, or a question, or a request to revise. It said, "Agreed. Start when you're ready. No rush." And below that, in the same plain, careful handwriting, I heard Margaret Hargrove came to see you yesterday. I hope she didn't give you trouble. Eleanor read the second line 3 times. She wrote back on the back of the same paper. "Nothing I couldn't manage. I'll start the curtain fabric this week." She handed it to Will. He folded it into his pocket. "Can I ask you something?" Eleanor said. "Yes, ma'am." "How does Mr. Dawson know about Mrs. Hargrove's visit?" Will had the look of a man being asked a question he'd hoped to avoid. "Red Hollow's a small town," he said. "That's not an answer." Will adjusted his hat. "Mr. Dawson makes it his business to know when people are trying to push other people around," he said, in the tone of a man reciting something he believed to be factually accurate. "He doesn't like it much. Never has." She considered this. "Does he do this often?" she said. "Make other people's business his business." "No, ma'am," Will said. "That's kind of the thing about it. He doesn't as a rule. Mostly he stays out of people's affairs entirely." He picked up the reins. "You being an exception is the part worth noticing, I reckon." He drove away before she could decide what to say to that. She stood in her doorway and watched the cart go, and thought about exceptions and what it meant to be one, and whether she trusted the feeling that was starting very quietly, very carefully, to put down roots somewhere in the vicinity of her chest. She did not have a word for it yet. She was not sure she wanted one. The blankets came together quickly that week. She had always worked fast when she had a purpose, and there was something about this order, the specificity of it, the mountain blue wool, the knowledge of exactly who was going to use these blankets and sleep under them in the high country cold, that put a particular kind of focus in her. She was 2/3 through the first blanket when the trouble started. It did not come from Margaret Hargrove, which she might have expected. It came from Victor Whitmore. She had encountered Victor Whitmore only in passing before he was Harlan Whitmore's older brother, the one who had moved to Red Hollow 3 years ago from somewhere back east and set himself up in the banking business. He was not a loud man. He was, if anything, a quiet one, the kind of quiet that was not stillness but suppression, like a lid held down on something that wanted to boil. He came to her door on a Wednesday afternoon while she was cutting the curtain fabric, and he knocked 3 times in the precise measured way of a man who had decided exactly how many times he intended to knock. She opened the door. Victor Whitmore was perhaps 50, with the sort of pale-tended look of a man who spent little time outdoors and considered that a point of distinction. He was wearing a good coat, despite the summer heat, and holding his hat in front of him with both hands. "Miss Hayes," he said pleasantly, "I wonder if I might have a word." She did not invite him in. "About what?" "The property," he said. She had known in a back corner of her mind where she kept the things she was worried about, but refused to spend too much time on that this was coming. She had been renting her room and workspace from old Pete for 2 years. Pete had never raised the rent and had never suggested there was any problem, and she had told herself that was stable ground. She was looking at the reason it was not. "Pete's property," she said. "Mr. Grayson has agreed to sell," Victor said, still pleasant. "The transfer will complete at the end of the month, at which point I'll be reviewing all existing rental arrangements in the building." He paused. "I wanted to give you sufficient notice, as I think is only courteous." Eleanor held the door frame. The curtain fabric was on her table half cut. 8 winter blankets in progress. $4.20 that she had spent already on materials, because she had believed she had let herself believe that the Dawson order was solid ground, that she was finally building toward something. "How much notice?" she said. 2 weeks from Friday, he said. "Of course, if you're interested in continuing the rental arrangement, I'd be happy to discuss new terms." "What terms?" He named a monthly figure. It was nearly triple what she paid Pete. She looked at him. He looked back at her with the particular pleasantness of a man who had done this before and knew exactly what expression to wear while doing it. "I'll need time to consider," she said. "Of course," he said. "Take until Monday. I'll need your answer by Monday." He put his hat on and walked away. She closed the door. She stood in the middle of her workroom and she looked at the half-cut curtain fabric and the stacked blanket panels and her needle and her thread and the lamp she would not be able to afford if Victor Whitmore's new rent took effect. And she felt very specifically, very clearly, the feeling of the ground tilting. She had felt it before. She knew what came after. She sat down. She picked up the curtain fabric. She made herself cut the next section clean and straight because the work didn't care, and she needed the work right now more than she needed to think. Old Pete came that evening. He knocked twice, which was his custom, and when she opened the door, his face had the look of a man carrying something heavy and not finding the carrying comfortable. "I heard you had a visitor," he said. "Whitmore," she said. "I'm sorry, Eleanor." He came inside and sat down in the chair he always sat in, the one by the window. He was a big man, Pete, broad in the shoulders, with hands that looked like they'd been made for heavier work than had been available to them lately. "I didn't have a choice. The man made me an offer I couldn't. I've got medical bills, girl. My chest. You know it's been a problem." "I know," she said. She handed him coffee. "I'm not angry with you, Pete." "You ought to be. You needed to sell. You sold." She sat across from him. "When did it happen?" "2 weeks ago. I tried to—" He stopped, rubbed his forehead. "I tried to get a condition in the sale, that existing tenants would be honored for 12 months. He agreed to it in writing. Then this morning his lawyer sent a note saying the language didn't hold, that the agreement superseded it." He looked at his hands. "I don't know enough about legal papers to fight it. I don't have the money to fight it even if I did." Eleanor was quiet. "There are other rooms in town," Pete said without much conviction. "At Victor Whitmore's new rates there might not be," Eleanor said. He knew she was right. She could see it in his face. She looked at her work table. "I've got an order from the Dawson Ranch to finish," she said. "2 more weeks of work, maybe 3, if the curtains are complicated. I need somewhere to do it." "You have until the end of the month in this room," Pete said. "I made sure of that at least. The transfer doesn't complete until then." 12 days. She nodded. "I'll figure something out," she said. After Pete left, she sat alone in the workroom for a long time. The lamp burned low. She didn't replace it. She thought about Victor Whitmore's pleasant face and his too high rent, and the lawyer's note that made a written agreement disappear, and she thought about how this was always how it worked. Not loudly, not with cruelty, you could point to and name, but quietly with legal language and polite timing, and the kind of pressure that was designed to look like circumstance rather than intention. She thought about her mother. She thought about land fraud, about the way her family had lost their small piece of ground outside of Pueblo 11 years ago, a signed paper that turned out to mean something different than they'd been told, a bank that moved faster than anyone expected, a lawyer who explained afterward that nothing could be done. She had been 18. She had watched her father sit down at the kitchen table and not get up again for 3 days. She had told herself, after she had sworn to herself, that she would never be in that position again, that she would build something small enough to hold solid enough to keep that no one with legal papers could take out from under her. 12 days. She went to the Dawson Ranch Saturday morning without waiting for Will to come to her. She borrowed old Pete's mule for the 15 miles, which the mule accepted with the resigned stoicism of an animal that had been asked to do worse, and she made the climb in the early morning before the full weight of the summer heat settled in. The mountains were clear and sharp against the pale sky, the kind of morning that made you understand why people came to this part of the country and stayed. Caleb Dawson was in the yard when she rode in, working on a section of fence rail with a hand mallet. He looked up when he heard the mule. He watched her come, set down the mallet, and walked over to meet her. "Miss Hayes," he said. He looked at her face, and whatever he read there made him go still for a moment. "Come inside." She got down from the mule. "I need to talk to you about the order," she said. "About timing." "All right. There's a problem with my workspace." She said it plainly without decoration because she had found that plain was the only way to say the things that were hardest. "Victor Whitmore has bought the building I rent from Pete Grayson. He's setting new terms. I won't be able to afford them." She paused. "I wanted you to know in case it affects the schedule. I'll complete the order. I'm committed to that, but it may take longer than I said." Caleb Dawson looked at her for a long moment. "Whitmore," he said. Not a question. "Yes." "How long do you have in the current space?" 12 days. He nodded slowly. The hand mallet was still in his hand, and he turned it once the way he had turned his hat on the livery bench, without seeming to notice he was doing it. "I've got a room in the main house," he said. "Back of the house. Used to be a storage room. It's got a window and a solid floor. It would need to be cleared out, but that's an hour's work." He paused. "If you needed somewhere to work until you found a permanent solution." Eleanor looked at him. She wanted to say no immediately, the way you said no to things that made you feel something you weren't prepared to feel, the way you said no when yes was the thing that frightened you most. She said people would talk. "People are already talking," he said, which was true, which was so plainly, straightforwardly true that she almost laughed. "I'd pay rent," she said. "You'd pay materials cost on the order. he said. "That's sufficient." "Mr. Dawson." "Caleb," he said, for the first time, quietly without making a ceremony of it. Just the name plain and offered. She looked at him. He looked back at her steadily. "I am not a charity case," she said. Her voice stayed even. She needed it to stay even. "I want you to understand that clearly. Whatever arrangement we make, it's a business arrangement. I work for what I receive." "I know that," he said. "I'm not offering charity. I'm offering a room with a window." He paused. "And I reckon you know the difference." She did know the difference. She had learned to read the difference with the particular precision of someone whose survival had sometimes depended on reading it correctly. She looked toward the mountains. The summer light was already warming the upper slopes, the rocky faces going from gray to amber as the sun climbed. "When can I see the room?" she said. He turned toward the house. "Now," he said. She followed him. The room was at the back of the house, past the kitchen, down a short hallway. It had indeed been used for storage. There were old harness parts and 2 broken saddle frames and a collection of crates that had been there long enough to gather significant dust. But the floor was solid plank, and the window faced east and caught the morning light cleanly, and the walls were sound. Eleanor stood in the middle of it and turned once, measuring with her eye. "I'd need a table," she said, "large enough for a full fabric spread, and a second lamp for evening work." "I'll get both," he said. "I'd work mornings and afternoons. I'd take my meals separately. I don't want to be in your way." "You won't be." "And I'd need to be able to receive deliveries. If I order fabric or materials, they need to come up here." "Will can handle that." She stopped turning. She looked at him directly. "Why are you doing this?" He was quiet for a moment, just long enough to make it clear that he was thinking about the honest answer, rather than the convenient one. "Because Whitmore has been buying up property in this county for 2 years, he said, "and every time he does, somebody loses something they should have been able to keep. And because you're trying to build something that deserves to be built." He paused. "And because I have a room with a window that nobody's using." She held his gaze for a long moment. "All right," she said. She moved in on Monday. It was not a dramatic move. She did not have much to move: her fabrics, her tools, her lamp. The small box of personal things that represented the sum of what she owned, that was not purely functional. Will helped her load Pete's cart and drive it up, and when they arrived, the storage room had been cleared, and the table Caleb had promised was already in place, solid and wide, pushed under the window to catch the east light. She did not see Caleb that morning. He was out with the cattle. She set up her workspace, and she ran her hand along the table surface. Good, solid pine, not new but well kept, and she thought about Margaret Hargrove's visit, and Victor Whitmore's pleasant face, and the 12 days she had been counting. She had 12 days once. Now she had a table by a window in the mountains. She threaded her needle and went to work. The change in the rhythm of her days was immediate and significant. She had always worked in a kind of suspended tension in town, aware of the proximity of people who wished her poorly, measuring herself against the ambient low-grade pressure of being someone Red Hollow had decided was beneath its notice. Up here, the tension was simply absent. There was the work. There was the light through the eastern window. There were the sounds of the ranch, the horses, the cattle in the distance, the occasional voices of the hands, and none of it touched her in the way that town sounds did. She did not see much of Caleb the first week. He worked long days. He ate his meals at the time working ranchers ate them, which was to say whenever there was a pause that allowed it. And he was up before she was, and often working past dark. She saw him at the water pump in the morning sometimes, and occasionally he came past the back of the house in the late afternoon, and they would exchange a few words about the order, about a delivery that was coming, practical things, and then go back to their respective work. It was a comfortable silence between two people who had both learned that silence was not emptiness. On the 5th day, she was deep in the second blanket when he came to the workroom door at noon and said, "There's food, if you want it." She had been going without lunch because she had not wanted to presume. "All right," she said, and she followed him to the kitchen. He ate plainly and without fuss, and she ate the same way. And they talked for the first time, really talked, without the framing of transactions or the weight of Red Hollow around them. He told her about the ranch, about how he had come to Colorado 6 years ago after his wife died, looking for somewhere that required enough of him that he did not have too much time to think. She told him about Pueblo and the land fraud, and her father's 3 days at the kitchen table, and how she had come to Red Hollow because she needed a town and Red Hollow was the nearest one. He listened the way he did everything attentively, without interrupting, without offering the kind of reassurances that were really about making the listener comfortable rather than the speaker. "Your father," he said when she had finished. "Where is he now?" "Gone," she said. 2 years after we lost the land. He was not a man who could survive losing what he'd built. Caleb was quiet for a moment. "I understand that," he said, and the way he said it made it clear he understood it from the inside, not from the outside, which was a different thing entirely. She looked at him. "How do you survive it?" she said. "When you lose what you built." He thought about it. "You build something smaller," he said finally. "Small enough that it fits inside what you've got left. And then you wait, and if you're still standing after a while, maybe you try something a little bigger. And you keep doing that." He picked up his coffee. "It's not fast." "No," she said. "But it works," he said. "Mostly." She thought about 7 blankets in the summer dust. About the mountain blue wool she had folded into the center of the stack. About 12 days becoming a table by a window. "Mostly," she agreed. She was clearing the kitchen things when Will came in from outside, moving with the urgency of a young man who had bad news and wasn't sure how to deliver it. "There's a man downstairs," he said. "Came up from town. He says he's got a letter from Victor Whitmore's lawyer." Eleanor went still. Caleb came in from his doorway where he had been standing. He looked at Will. "What kind of letter?" Will pulled a folded document from his coat. I haven't read it, sir. It's addressed to Miss Hayes." She took it. She opened it. She read it once quickly. Then she read it again slowly because the first reading hadn't made sense, and she needed the second to confirm that it meant what she thought it meant. She looked up. "He's claiming I owe him back rent," she said, "on the property I rented from Pete Grayson. He says when he purchased the property, Pete's rental agreements transferred to him, and that I owe 3 months back rent at his new rate retroactive to the start of the year." The kitchen was very quiet. "Can he do that?" Will said. She looked at Caleb. Caleb's expression had not changed, but something had shifted in it. Not anger exactly. Something older and more certain than anger. Something that looked like a man who had been waiting for a particular thing to happen, and was now watching it happen, and had already some time ago decided what he was going to do about it. "He can try," Caleb said. He held out his hand for the letter. She gave it to him. He read it. He folded it. He set it on the table. "I know a man in Denver," he said. "A lawyer. A good one. He's handled land cases in this county before." He looked at Eleanor. "With your permission, I'd like to write to him today." She looked at the letter on the table. 3 months of back rent at Victor Whitmore's rates was more money than she had made in the last 6 months combined. It was not a real debt. She knew it was not a real debt. But that was the point, that it didn't have to be real to be a problem. Because fighting a false debt cost money the same as fighting a real one, and Victor Whitmore knew she didn't have it. Her father's face at the kitchen table. 3 days. Gone 2 years later. "Write to him," she said. Caleb picked up the letter. He started toward the door. Then he stopped. He turned back. "Eleanor," he said. It was the first time he had used her name, not Miss Hayes. "Eleanor." She looked at him. "He does this because he thinks you're alone," he said. "He's wrong about that." He walked out. She stood in the kitchen, and she listened to his boots on the floorboards going away, and she put her hand flat on the kitchen table, and she breathed, and she thought about what it felt like to have someone say a true thing, plainly, without dressing it up or making it about themselves. She had not had anyone say that kind of thing to her in a very long time. She was not sure she knew how to hold it without dropping it. But she was going to try. The letter from Victor Whitmore's lawyer sat on the kitchen table for exactly 1 day before Caleb's response to it began to take shape. Eleanor watched it happen the way you watched a river after a dam gave way. Not with drama, not with noise, but with the quiet, unstoppable certainty of something that had been held back too long and was now simply going where it was always going to go. Caleb wrote to his lawyer in Denver that same evening. She knew because she heard him at the desk in the front room after supper, the scratch of pen on paper going steadily for the better part of an hour. He did not ask her to come and look at what he was writing. He did not summarize it for her afterward. He simply told her when he came to say good night, which he had begun doing in the past few days, with the same matter-of-fact regularity with which he did everything that the letter was sent, and that Thomas Hale the lawyer was a man who answered his correspondence quickly. How quickly? She said. 3-4 days, he said. He's thorough. He won't write back until he knows what he's talking about. And if Whitmore moves before then? Caleb looked at her steadily. Then we deal with what he does, he said. One thing at a time. She had spent most of her life dealing with many things at a time. The idea of one thing at a time felt almost dangerously simple. All right, she said. Get some sleep, he said. The curtain panels won't stitch themselves. She almost smiled. They might, she said, if I ask nicely. He looked at her for just a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then he turned and went back down the hall, and she stood in the doorway of her workroom and listened to the house settle around her in the mountain dark. 3 days passed. She finished the curtain panels on the second day and began the third blanket on the third, and Will hung the curtains in the bunkhouse while she worked. And when he came back, he said the hands had stood around looking at them with the expressions of men who were not accustomed to having anything in their living space that was not purely functional and were not entirely sure what to do with the feeling. Joe Perkins said they make the place look almost civilized, Will reported. High praise, Eleanor said. Highest praise Joe's got. Will confirmed and went back to his work. It was on the third evening, just after the supper dishes were done, that Red Hollow came back to them. Will came in fast from outside, the way he moved when something was wrong, and found both Caleb and Eleanor at the kitchen table. Eleanor with her notes. Caleb with a cup of coffee and a week-old newspaper he was reading, with the patient attention of a man who had no illusions that the news was going to improve his evening. Will put his hat on the table and said, Douglas Hargrove's here, out front. He says he needs to speak to Mr. Dawson. Caleb set down the paper. Just Hargrove, he said. And 2 other men, town men. I don't know their names. Eleanor looked at Caleb. He looked back at her with that level expression she had learned in these past days to read more carefully than she'd been able to at first. There was something behind it now, not worry, not anger, preparation. You don't have to go anywhere, he said to her. This is my house. I wasn't planning to go anywhere, she said. He almost smiled. Just the corner of it. Then he pushed back from the table and went out. She waited exactly 2 minutes. Then she followed him. Douglas Hargrove was on the porch, hat in hand, with 2 men she recognized from town council meetings she had watched through windows, not being the kind of person invited inside. All 3 of them had the look of men who had come with a prepared speech and were slightly wrong-footed to find Caleb already on the steps, arms crossed, waiting for them. Eleanor stood in the doorway. Hargrove saw her. His expression shifted just briefly, just a flicker of something that might have been surprise or might have been satisfaction. She couldn't tell which, and she did not like that she couldn't tell. Caleb, Hargrove said, with the warmth of a man addressing someone whose goodwill he wanted. Good evening. I apologize for the hour. Douglas, Caleb said. What can I do for you? Hargrove glanced at Eleanor again. Then he looked back at Caleb. We've come on a matter of some community concern, he said. About the arrangement you've made here with Miss Hayes. She's working on an order, Caleb said. What's the concern? Caleb. Hargrove's voice dropped to the register men used when they were trying to make something sound like plain speaking when it was actually anything but. You know how people talk. And the situation here, a woman living on your property without... She's renting a workroom, Caleb said. Same as she rented a room in town. Victor Whitmore made the town arrangement untenable, so she moved her work here. That's the full extent of the situation. Hargrove had the grace to look briefly uncomfortable at the mention of Whitmore's name. Be that as it may. Victor Whitmore, Caleb said, and his voice had gone very quiet, which Eleanor had learned was not the same as gentle, bought Pete Grayson's building, and is now claiming back rent on a lease that was finalized before he took ownership. I've contacted Thomas Hale in Denver. I expect you know who Thomas Hale is. The two town councilmen exchanged a look. Hargrove's chin came up. This isn't about Whitmore. I think it is, Caleb said. I think you came here because Whitmore asked you to. And I think you said yes because that's what you do, Douglas. You go where the money points, and you call it community concern. He paused. I'm not going to ask Miss Hayes to leave. I'm not going to change the arrangement, and I'll thank you to take that back to whoever sent you. Hargrove stood on the porch steps, and his face went through several colors in quick succession. Eleanor watched the calculation happen, the weighing of how much Caleb Dawson's displeasure cost against how much Victor Whitmore's goodwill was worth. You're making an enemy, Hargrove said. It was meant to be a warning. It came out sounding like an admission. I've had enemies, Caleb said. I'll manage. He turned to go back inside. Good night, Douglas. Hargrove stood there a moment longer, looking at the closed door. Then he looked at Eleanor still in the doorway. She held his gaze and did not move. He put his hat on and walked away. She went back inside. Caleb was at the kitchen table pouring himself another cup of coffee. He poured a second cup without asking and set it in front of her chair. She sat down. He's going to go back to Whitmore, she said. Yes, Caleb said. And Whitmore is going to do something else. Yes, he said again, in the tone of a man discussing whether not resigned, just factual. He will. Then why? She stopped. She was going to ask then, why stand against him? And then she realized she already knew the answer. She had known it since the kitchen table, since he does this because he thinks you're alone. She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. Tell me about Thomas Hale, she said. For the next half hour, Caleb told her about Thomas Hale, how they'd met, what cases Hale had handled in Colorado Territory, what kind of man he was. He spoke about it without embellishment, but with the precision of someone who had thought carefully about who he trusted and why. She listened, and she asked questions, and he answered them, and somewhere in that half hour, the thing she had been careful not to name began to have a shape she could almost see. She did not look at it directly, not yet. She went to bed and lay awake in the mountain dark and thought about her father at the kitchen table, and about what it meant to have someone in your corner who did not need you to make yourself smaller in order to earn it. Thomas Hale's reply arrived on day 4, delivered by a rider from town who had the look of a man who had been riding fast and was glad to be done with it. Caleb read it in the doorway of the workroom, while Eleanor kept her hands on the fabric and her eyes on him. Well, she said. The back rent claim is fraudulent, he said. Hale's words, not mine. The purchase agreement Whitmore signed specifically excluded assumption of prior tenant arrangements. He can't retroactively apply new lease terms to a tenancy that predates his ownership. He looked up. You don't owe him anything. She stopped stitching. She had known intellectually that the claim was false. But knowing something, and hearing someone who understood legal documents say it plainly in black ink on paper from Denver, those were two different things, and the distance between them was the distance between surviving something and actually being free of it. What does Hale recommend? She said. He's filing a formal response today. He's also made inquiries about Whitmore's other recent property transactions in this county. Caleb paused. It seems ours isn't the first irregular claim. She looked at him. How many others? At least 3, possibly more. He folded the letter. There's a widow on Callaway Street. She lost her house 6 months ago, paid what Whitmore's lawyer said she owed and left. He paused. She didn't have to. Eleanor set the fabric down on the table. She thought about a widow paying money she didn't owe, because she didn't know she didn't owe it. She thought about her father. She thought about land fraud and legal language and the pleasant, measured face of a man who knew exactly how to hold the lid down until something boiled away. "Can anything be done," she said, "for the widow?" Hale thinks possibly, if she can be found and agrees to pursue it. He looked at her. "That's a longer fight. But it can be fought." "It can be fought," he said. She picked the fabric back up. "Then it should be," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "I'll write to Hale." She went back to stitching. What happened next moved faster than Eleanor was prepared for, which she later understood was the point. Men like Victor Whitmore depended on speed on the gap between the thing happening and the people it happened to finding their footing. 3 days after Hale filed the formal response to the back rent claim, Victor Whitmore came to the ranch himself. Eleanor was in the workroom when she heard the horse in the yard. She heard Will's voice, and then another voice measured pleasant carrying, and she set down her work and walked to the kitchen window. Whitmore was in the yard. He had a man with him she didn't recognize, not a hand, not a tradesman. The kind of man who stood slightly behind and to the left of other men. Caleb came out of the barn. Eleanor moved to the back door. "Mr. Dawson," Whitmore said. Still pleasant. Always pleasant. "I wonder if we might speak privately." "We can speak here," Caleb said. Whitmore's eyes moved past. Caleb found Eleanor in the doorway and stopped there for a moment. Something behind the pleasantness shifted. Not much, just enough to see. "Your lawyer has filed some challenging paperwork," Whitmore said, turning back to Caleb. "I'd like to discuss it between us as neighbors before this becomes something none of us want." "I'm not sure what you think none of us want," Caleb said. "Miss Hayes and I know what we want. We want accurate legal accounting and an honest process." Whitmore smiled. "I've invested considerably in this community," he said. "The new mill road, the schoolhouse repairs. I believe most people here would say I've been a benefit." "I believe most people here haven't read your purchase agreements," Caleb said. Whitmore's smile held. He was very good at holding the smile. "I came to offer a resolution," he said. "I'll withdraw the back rent claim. In exchange, I'd ask that the inquiries into my other property dealings be set aside." Eleanor stepped fully out onto the back step. Every eye in the yard moved to her. "That's not a resolution," she said. "That's a trade. You take back the false claim you never should have made, and in exchange, we let you keep what you took from people who didn't know they could fight back." She looked at him directly. "The widow on Calloway Street. What do you plan to offer her?" Whitmore looked at her with an expression that was no longer entirely pleasant. "Miss Hayes," he said, "I understand you've had some difficulties. I have no wish to make your situation worse." "My situation," she said, "is fine." "Is it?" His voice had gone quiet. Not threatening. Worse than threatening considering. The voice of a man reviewing options. "You've placed a great deal of trust in Mr. Dawson's goodwill. I'd simply caution you to think about what happens to your situation if that goodwill shifts." The yard went very still. Eleanor heard it for what it was. It was not a threat to her. It was a suggestion offered calmly, almost kindly, that Caleb might abandon her. That she was here on borrowed ground, that his support was a variable thing, that if Whitmore applied the right pressure in the right place, she would find herself standing alone again. It was exactly the kind of thing that was designed to hit the oldest, deepest wound. She felt it hit. She kept her face level. She heard Caleb move. He stepped up beside her. Not in front of her, beside her. Close enough that she could feel the solidity of him, the uncomplicated certainty of it. "Mr. Whitmore," he said. His voice was very quiet. "You came here to offer Eleanor a deal that benefits you and costs the people you've already wronged. She's told you what she thinks of it. I'll tell you what I think of it." He paused. "Get off my land." Whitmore looked at them both. Something moved through his expression, fast, cold, and gone. "You'll regret this," he said. Not pleasantly, just plainly. "Maybe," Caleb said, "but not today." Whitmore and his silent companion rode out. Eleanor stood on the back step and watched them go, and did not move until the sound of the horses was gone and the yard was quiet again. Then she let out a breath she had been holding since Whitmore's eyes had landed on her in the doorway. "He's going to come back harder," she said. "Yes," Caleb said. "We need Hale to move fast. I'll wire him today." He paused. "Are you all right?" She considered the question. She considered the what happens to your situation if that goodwill shifts, and the way it had gone straight to the place it was aimed for, clean and precise as a well-thrown knife. "I'm not sure he was entirely wrong," she said, "that I'm here on borrowed ground." Caleb turned to look at her. "What does that mean?" "It means I am in your house on your land because you offered me a room. That was your choice to make. He was suggesting—" She stopped. She made herself say it. "He was suggesting you might change your mind." "He was trying to make you doubt me," Caleb said, "so you'd make the deal without my help." "I know that. It didn't make it—" She paused. "It didn't make it not land." He was quiet for a moment. "Eleanor," he said, and his voice had the weight it always had when he used her name. Not heavy, just real. "I told you he was wrong about you being alone. I meant it. That's not the kind of thing I say when I don't mean it." She looked at him. "I know," she said quietly. "That's what made it hard. Because I believe you. And I haven't believed someone like that in a long time. And not believing was—" She stopped again. Not believing was safe. He didn't fill the silence. He let it be what it was. "Believing is better," he said finally, "even when it's harder." She looked out at the empty yard. "I'm finding that out," she said. She went back to the workroom. She sat down at the table. She put her hands on the fabric, and she did not pick up the needle for several minutes. She was not afraid of a Whitmore. She had been afraid of things larger than Victor Whitmore and survived them. What she was, she searched for the word and found it plain and slightly uncomfortable. What she was open. More open than she had been in years. And open things could be hurt in ways that closed things could not. She picked up the needle. That was still true, and she was still going to choose it. She had 3 more blankets to finish. What Whitmore did next, he did with the kind of precision that told her he had been planning it before he came to the ranch. He had come to offer the deal first. She understood that now. He had come to give them the chance to settle quietly, and when they hadn't, he moved to the thing he had already prepared. The notice arrived at the ranch 2 days later. Not a legal document, something more careful than that, more difficult to fight. It was a letter signed by 6 members of the Red Hollow Town Council addressed to Caleb Dawson, expressing the council's concern about the nature of the arrangement between Caleb and Eleanor, and respectfully suggesting that for the sake of community standards, Miss Hayes should find more appropriate lodgings. It was not a legal order. It had no enforceable weight. But it had 6 signatures and the words, "community standards," and in a territory where social standing was a kind of currency, it was designed to cost something. Will brought it in from the post and set it on the kitchen table with the expression of a man who wished he'd been assigned any other errand that morning. Caleb read it once. He set it down. He picked up his coffee. 6 signatures, he said. "Hargrove," Eleanor said. "First," he said. He read the names. She knew 2 of them. Both were men with money and property, and a long history of knowing which way a wind was blowing before it shifted. 4 of those 6, she said slowly, have had property dealings with Whitmore in the last 2 years. Caleb looked at her. "How do you know that?" "I pay attention," she said. "In town, people talk about land deals the way they talk about weather. They assume nobody who matters is listening." She paused. "I was always in the room. Just not the kind of person they thought would remember." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "What do you remember?" she told him. It took most of the morning, and when she was done, he had filled 2 pages of paper with notes in his plain, careful handwriting, and his expression had gone through several shifts she had not seen before. Not surprise exactly, but a deepening, a recalibration of something. "This is what Hale needs," he said. "I thought it might be," she said. "I didn't know I'd need it. I just kept track." He looked at her across the table. "Eleanor," he said, "do you know what you've just given us?" "Information," she said. "You've given us the pattern," he said. "Not just your case, the whole thing." He leaned forward slightly. "Every property Whitmore has touched in this county in 2 years, every irregular claim. Hale can take this to the territorial court." She had not thought that far ahead. She had been thinking about her own case, about the back rent, about staying in the workroom, until she could find permanent footing. She had not been thinking about territorial court. Is that something that can actually happen?" she said. "If Hale says yes, then yes," Caleb said. He was already folding the notes. "I'm going to wire him this afternoon. I want these in his hands today." He stood. Then he stopped. "This is going to get louder before it gets quiet," he said. "Whitmore is going to know where this came from. He's going to come at you specifically." She met his eyes. "He already did," she said. "Yesterday in the yard. It didn't work." "That was a warning," Caleb said. "The next thing won't be." She held his gaze. "I know," she said. "Do it anyway." He looked at her for one long moment. Then he nodded once and picked up his hat and went to send the wire. She went back to the blankets. The next thing Whitmore did came 4 days later, and it was not aimed at her. It was aimed at Caleb. It came in the form of a man named Gerald Pruitt, who arrived at the ranch on a Wednesday with a document claiming to be a survey dispute, a challenge to the boundary line of the Dawson Ranch's eastern grazing land, asserting that 40 acres of Caleb's best summer pasture actually fell within the limits of a land parcel that Victor Whitmore had purchased 6 weeks prior. Eleanor was in the workroom when she heard the raised voices. She had been waiting for something. She had not known what shape it would take. She came out and found Caleb in the yard holding Pruitt's document, and Pruitt standing back at a careful distance, and Will nearby with the expression of a young man who had his hands by his sides and was waiting to find out what was going to be required of them. Caleb looked up when Eleanor came out. "Go back inside," he said. "No," she said. She held out her hand for the document. He looked at her. She waited. He gave her the document. She read it. She read it again. "This survey reference," she said to Pruitt. "Survey number 47, Colorado Territory Land Office, 1872. Are you familiar with it?" Pruitt blinked. "The document cites, Survey 47 covered the valley floor," she said. "It ended at the ridge line, which Caleb's eastern boundary predates by 3 years. His original land grant is from 1869. She looked up at Pruitt. "I'm not a lawyer, but I've spent enough time in county records rooms to know what that means. This survey can't dispute his boundary because it doesn't cover the relevant elevation." Pruitt stared at her. Caleb was very still. "Where did you?" Pruitt started. "The County Land Records Office," Eleanor said. "I looked up Mr. Dawson's grant when I moved here. I wanted to know whose land I was on." She kept her voice level. "Go back to Mr. Whitmore and tell him that we know what Survey 47 covers, and tell him that Thomas Hale in Denver has been informed of this claim as of this morning." Pruitt looked at Caleb. Caleb looked back at him without expression. Pruitt took his document and left. The yard was quiet for a long moment. Then Will said to no one in particular, "She looked up the land grant." "I wanted to know whose land I was on," Eleanor said again. "You looked up his land grant," Will repeated with the wonder of a man who had just watched something unexpected happen and was still adjusting to it. Caleb turned to her. He had an expression she had not seen before, not the level steadiness she'd come to know, not the contained warmth of the kitchen table conversations. Something unguarded, something that had been quietly held in reserve and was now very slightly visible. "You knew about the survey," he said, "before today." "Yes," she said. "You've been watching Whitmore, keeping records. And you knew my land grant." "Yes." A pause. "Why didn't you tell me?" he said. She looked at him. "Because I didn't know if I was staying," she said simply. "I didn't want to be the woman who gathered information about a man's property and then used it to make herself necessary." The words landed between them. He looked at her for a long time. "Eleanor," he said finally, quietly, "you were never going to have to make yourself necessary." She did not answer. The afternoon light was long across the yard, the way summer light got in the mountains, when the day was starting to think about letting go, and she stood in it and held the survey document in her hands, and thought about borrowed ground and open things, and the specific difficulty of believing someone, when believing them meant you could be hurt in ways that not believing them could not reach. She had chosen it. She was still choosing it. Will cleared his throat. Should I send for Hale?" "Wire him today," Caleb said, not taking his eyes off Eleanor. "Tell him about the survey claim, and tell him we have documentation on the land grant." "Yes, sir." Will went. The yard was empty. The mountain light held. "He's going to come to town," Eleanor said. "Whitmore. He's going to make this public. The council letter, the boundary claim, he's building something. A case or the appearance of one. He's going to bring it into the open where more people can see it." "I know," Caleb said. "When he does," she said, "it won't just be a legal fight. He's going to make it about you and me. About this." She gestured, meaning the house, the workroom, the meals at the kitchen table, all of it. "He's going to use it." "I know that too," he said. She looked at him. "Does that change anything for you?" He held her gaze without hesitation. "No," he said. She breathed. "Then we should be ready," she said. "We will be," he said. Neither of them moved for a moment. The mountain held the light the way it always did not, keeping it, just passing it along, letting it run through on its way to somewhere else. Then she turned and went back inside, and she sat down at the workroom table, and she finished the fourth blanket before dark. She was not afraid. She was open. And she was ready for whatever was coming next. Thomas Hale arrived on a Thursday. Eleanor heard the horse before she saw the man, and she was already standing in the kitchen doorway when Will brought him through the gate. He was smaller than she had imagined, lean somewhere past 60, with the precise, unhurried movements of a man who had learned long ago that speed and haste were not the same thing. He carried a leather case that looked like it had crossed the territory several times and intended to keep crossing it. Caleb came out of the barn and shook Hale's hand without ceremony, and the three of them sat down at the kitchen table within 10 minutes of his arrival, because Thomas Hale was the kind of man who did not require settling in before he got to the point. "I've reviewed everything," Hale said. He opened the leather case. "The back rent claim, the council letter, the boundary survey, and the information Miss Hayes provided about Whitmore's other property transactions." He spread papers across the table, with the efficiency of a man who had arranged papers across many tables and knew exactly how to do it. "Here is where we stand." He talked for 40 minutes. Eleanor listened to every word. She had taught herself over years of having very little and needing to make it count to listen to people who knew things she didn't, with the full weight of her attention, not waiting for what she already understood, but tracking the unfamiliar, storing it, making sense of it as it came. What Hale laid out was this. The back rent claim was not only fraudulent, but provably so based on the language of the purchase agreement Whitmore had signed. The boundary survey dispute was based on a misapplication of a survey that predated Whitmore's land purchase and could not legally be used to challenge the Dawson grant. And the pattern, Eleanor had documented the property transactions, the irregular claims, the widow on Calloway Street. At least 2 other cases Hale had found since formed something that was no longer just a collection of individual problems. "It's a scheme," Hale said. He said it plainly without drama, because it was a plain fact and dramatic language was not in his professional repertoire. Victor Whitmore has been systematically acquiring property in this county by creating false legal claims against owners who lack the resources or the legal knowledge to dispute them. When they can't fight, he acquires their property at distressed prices or forces them out of existing arrangements. He paused. It's been effective because he's been careful. Each individual case looks like a dispute, not a pattern. You need all of them together to see what it is. "And now we have them together," Caleb said. "We do," Hale said. thanks to Miss Hayes." Eleanor looked at the papers. Her notes were among them, the careful records she'd kept without knowing exactly why she was keeping them, the accumulation of things set in rooms she hadn't been supposed to matter in. "What happens now?" she said. "I file with the territorial court," Hale said. "Fraud of this scale, the judge in this circuit is a man named Aldridge. I've appeared before him. He is not a man who likes what Whitmore has been doing." He paused. "But I want to be honest with you about timing. Court processes take time. Whitmore will be served notice. He'll have the opportunity to respond. There will be proceedings. Weeks, possibly months." "And in the meantime," Eleanor said. "In the meantime," Hale said, "Whitmore knows what's coming, and men who know what's coming tend to act before it arrives." The three of them sat with that for a moment. "He'll go public," Caleb said. "In town, before the filing reaches him." "That's my expectation," Hale said. "He'll try to control the story. Make it about something other than what it is." Eleanor already knew what he would make it about. She had known since the ranch yard, since what happens to your situation, if that goodwill shifts. He would make it about her, about a woman with nothing to her name living on a man's property, about what kind of woman that made her. He would wrap it in language about community standards and appropriate arrangements, and he would make Red Hollow look at the wrong thing while the right thing moved quietly toward a courtroom in Denver. "Then we should file before he speaks," she said. Both men looked at her. "How fast can you file?" she said to Hale. Hale considered. "If I leave tomorrow, I can be in Denver by Saturday. I can have the filing before Aldridge by Monday morning." "Do it," she said. "Eleanor," Caleb started. "He's going to come into town, and he's going to make it about us," she said. "About me and you, and what people have been saying since you bought 7 blankets off a dusty street. That's his move. If the filing is already in front of a judge before he makes it, it changes what his move does." She looked at Hale. "He can say whatever he wants about me. He can't unsay a fraud filing in territorial court." Hale looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite categorize, somewhere between assessment and something warmer. "You've thought about this," he said. "I've had time," she said. Hale looked at Caleb. Caleb was looking at Eleanor. He had that expression again, the one she had first seen in the ranch yard after Pruitt left the one that was slightly unguarded. She had come to understand in the days since that unguarded was not a state Caleb Dawson reached easily or quickly. She understood also that it meant something specific when he did. "File on Monday," Caleb said to Hale. "Whatever you need from us before then, we'll have it ready." Hale nodded. He began reorganizing his papers. "There's one more thing," he said in the tone of a man who had been saving a particular item. He pulled a single sheet from the bottom of his case. "I've been in contact with the widow on Calloway Street. Her name is Agnes Pruitt. She lost her home in February." He set the paper on the table. "She's willing to be part of the filing. Her case strengthens the pattern considerably." Eleanor's throat tightened. She had not met Agnes Pruitt. She did not know her. She knew only what Caleb had told her. A widow February, a sum of money paid that she had never owed, a house she had left because she did not know she had the right to stay. "Is she all right?" Eleanor said. "She's staying with her daughter," Hale said. "She's managing." He paused. "She asked me to tell you that she's grateful. That she would not have known to come forward if not for the inquiry on her behalf." Eleanor put her hands flat on the table. She thought about the inquiry, about Caleb in this kitchen the evening after she had told him about the widow, saying, "I'll write to Hale." She had not thought about it again, not deliberately. She had had enough to think about, but he had written, and Hale had found Agnes Pruitt, and Agnes Pruitt had said yes. Small chains of cause running from one person's quiet action to another person's chance at something that should never have been taken. "Thank you," she said to Hale. "Thank your instinct to fight it," he said. He closed his case. People who choose not to are also understandable. It's not nothing choosing to. Hale stayed the night and rode out before dawn. and the ranch settled into the particular quiet of a place where something significant had just been set in motion, and everyone in it was aware of that, and nobody was entirely sure what shape it would take when it arrived. Eleanor finished the 5th blanket that afternoon. She was starting on the 6th when Caleb appeared in the workroom doorway. "You should eat," he said. "I'm not done," she said. "The blanket isn't going anywhere." She set down the needle and followed him to the kitchen, because she had learned in the weeks she had been here that when Caleb Dawson suggested something, it was generally either sensible or important, and arguing with sensible was a waste of the energy she did not have to waste. They ate. Will had made stew, which he did every Thursday with the stubborn consistency of a young man who had mastered one meal and was deeply committed to it. It was good stew. Eleanor had told him so the first Thursday, and he had looked like she had given him something worth keeping. "He's going to move fast," Caleb said, when the stew was half done. "Whitmore, now that Hale is gone, he'll know something's changed." "I know," Eleanor said. "It may not wait until he hears about the filing," he said. "He may already be planning something for this weekend. The town meeting is Saturday." She had forgotten about the town meeting. She forgot about most things that happened in Red Hollow these days. The mountain had its own rhythm, and she had begun to move with it. "He'll bring the council letter," she said. "Make it formal. Ask the town to weigh in." "Probably," Caleb said. He was quiet for a moment. "I want to go," he said. She looked up. "To the town meeting?" "Yes." "With me?" she said. "Yes," he said. She set her spoon down. "Caleb, if you walk into that meeting with me, he gets exactly what he wants. The whole room looking at the two of us instead of at what he's done." "I know," he said. "Then why?" "Because hiding from it is the same as admitting there's something to hide," he said. "We've done nothing wrong. You've done nothing wrong. And I'm not going to sit up here on the mountain while Victor Whitmore stands in front of this town and implies otherwise." She looked at him across the table. "He's going to say things," she said. "About me. About what I am. In this house. He's going to use the word arrangement and let people fill it in." "Let him," Caleb said. "The people in that room know me. They've known me for 6 years. And by the time this week is out, they're going to know about the fraud filing too." His voice was steady and completely certain. "I want you standing next to me when they do. Not because you need me there, because I want them to see what standing next to each other looks like, what it actually means." She was quiet for a long time. The stew cooled. Neither of them touched it. "All right," she said. Saturday came with the particular weight of days that have been anticipated too long, and Eleanor dressed carefully not to impress, but because she understood that the way you presented yourself in a room that expected you to look beaten was its own kind of statement. Her best dress was 3 years old, and had been mended twice at the collar, and it was clean and pressed, and she wore it like it was new. Caleb was waiting in the kitchen when she came out. He had shaved. She noticed. She did not say anything about it. They rode into Red Hollow together on his 2 best horses, and Will came behind them on the cart, because Will had decided on his own that he was coming and had not asked anyone's permission, which Eleanor found she was unexpectedly glad of. The town meeting was held in the church hall, as it always was. The building was already full when they arrived. Eleanor could feel the shift in the room from the doorway, the pausing of conversations, the turning of heads, the particular quality of attention that a room gave to the thing it had been waiting to talk about. She walked in with Caleb beside her, and she kept her chin level and her hands at her sides, and she looked at no one in particular, which meant she saw all of them. Margaret Hargrove in the 3rd row, with an expression that was more complex than Eleanor had expected. Not triumphant. Almost uncertain. Old Pete near the back, who caught Eleanor's eye and gave her a small nod that she felt more than she saw. Douglas Hargrove at the front beside Victor Whitmore, who stood with his hat in his hands and the pleasant expression of a man who had arranged things to his satisfaction. The meeting opened with mundane things: road repairs, the schoolhouse calendar, a dispute about water rights on the far side of town that had nothing to do with any of them. Eleanor sat through it with her hands in her lap and her breathing even, and she waited. When Whitmore's item came, he rose from his chair slowly, with the measured deliberation of a man who had rehearsed the moment. "I'd like to raise a matter of community concern," he said, "about the moral character of this town and the standards we hold ourselves to." He talked for 6 minutes. Eleanor counted. He talked about community values and the reputation of Red Hollow and the importance of proper arrangements between men and women. He talked about the example set for younger residents. He used the word arrangement 3 times each time, with the particular pause that let people fill it in. He said Eleanor's name twice and Caleb's name once, and he never once said anything that was technically a lie. He was very good at it. When he finished, the room was very quiet. Douglas Hargrove started to speak. Caleb stood up. The room went quieter. Caleb did not have a prepared speech. Eleanor knew this because she had been with him the previous evening when the meeting was discussed, and he had not written anything down, had not practiced anything, had simply said he would speak when it was time. She had not asked him what he planned to say, because she had somehow known that asking would be the wrong thing. He stood in the center of the town hall, and he looked around it at the people he had lived near for 6 years, at the council members at Whitmore, at the faces along the walls, and he said, "Miss Eleanor Hayes came to this town and built a business from nothing. She learned her trade. She provided for herself without asking anyone for help and without taking anything from anyone. She's a person of absolute integrity, and I know that because I've worked with her, talked with her, and had the considerable privilege of watching her refuse to be moved by things that would have moved most people." He paused. Victor Whitmore made a fraudulent claim against her. He tried to take money she didn't owe him. When she didn't fold, he sent Douglas Hargrove to my door, and then he came himself. And when neither of those things worked, he had 6 men sign a letter suggesting she was living improperly in my home. He paused again. She was not. She was working, as she has always worked, as she will continue to work regardless of what this room decides to believe about her tonight. Whitmore opened his mouth. "Thomas Hale filed documents with the territorial court on Monday morning," Caleb said. "Fraud charges against Victor Whitmore covering 6 property transactions in this county over the past 2 years. The widow Agnes Pruitt, whom most of you know, is among the plaintiffs. He let that land. He let it settle across the room the way a flat stone settled into still water, all the way to the edges. If anyone in this room would like to speak to Mr. Hale directly, I can provide his contact in Denver. He is happy to share the documentation." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence from the one that had followed Whitmore's speech. That silence had been full. This one was empty. The silence of a room having a thought it had not expected to have. Margaret Hargrove turned in her seat and looked at Victor Whitmore. Hargrove looked at the floor. Whitmore's pleasant expression had not moved, but something behind it had. Eleanor could see it from across the room. Not fear, not yet. Something earlier than fear. The recognition that the ground had shifted in a way he had not planned for, and that the pleasant expression which had served him very well for a very long time was not designed for shifted ground. "Agnes Pruitt," someone said, quietly from the middle of the room. Eleanor didn't see who. "He took Agnes Pruitt's house, February," Caleb said. "She's at her daughter's in Junction." A murmur moved through the room. Agnes Pruitt was evidently a name people knew. Eleanor filed that away. Whitmore said, "These allegations are—" "Mr. Hale is a very thorough man," Caleb said, "and he is not given to filing things he cannot support." Whitmore looked at the room. The room looked back at him. The mathematics of the thing were happening in real time, and Eleanor watched it on the faces around her. The revision, the recalculation, the small rearrangements of loyalty that happened when a man's pleasant surface was set next to a name like Agnes Pruitt's and a word like fraud, and the reality did not add up the way he'd been presenting it. Douglas Hargrove stood up. Eleanor braced. "I'd like to see the documentation," Hargrove said. "Not I stand behind Victor Whitmore. Not these are baseless claims. I'd like to see the documentation." Whitmore looked at Hargrove. Something crossed between them. Fast cold, the look of a man realizing that the person he'd believed was with him had just made a different calculation. "As would I," said a voice near the back. Old Pete. On his feet, his big hands hanging at his sides, his voice entirely calm. "I'd like to see it too." Two more voices, then a third. Eleanor looked at Caleb. He was standing in the same place with the same stillness, as if none of this was a surprise to him. As if he had simply laid something on a table and waited to see how people looked at it when the light was right. The meeting did not resolve that night. No vote was taken. No statement was issued. What happened instead was more complicated, and Eleanor thought more real than a vote. The room fractured quietly along lines that had always been there, but had needed a particular moment to become visible. People who had been silent spoke. People who had spoken loudly went quiet. Victor Whitmore left before the meeting formally closed, and nobody moved to follow him. And the space he left behind was not the space of a man who had won anything. Afterward, in the yard outside the church hall, old Pete found her. He looked at her with the face of a man carrying a debt he knew he couldn't fully repay. "I'm sorry, Eleanor," he said, "about the building." "You needed to sell?" she said. "I told you I'm not angry." "I know you said it," he said. "I needed to hear it again." He paused. "He told me the new lease terms would be fair, for existing tenants. He told me that, and I believed him." She looked at Pete. He was 63 years old with bad lungs and hands that ached in cold weather, and a medical bill he couldn't pay. And Victor Whitmore had told him what he needed to hear, and he had believed it because he needed to believe it. "He's good at telling people what they need to hear," she said. "You weren't fooled," Pete said. "I've been fooled before," she said. "By people like him. I learned what to look for." She put her hand briefly on his arm. "You don't have anything to be sorry for, Pete. He does." Pete nodded. He looked over her shoulder, and his expression shifted something that might have been tentative approval, and she turned and found Caleb standing a few feet behind her, giving them room, waiting without making anything of the waiting. "Good man," Pete said quietly. Not to Eleanor exactly, just into the air between them. She turned back around. Caleb was looking at her. "Ready," he said. "Yes," she said. They rode back toward the mountain in the last of the evening light. Will on the cart behind them. And none of them spoke much, because some things had been said tonight that needed room to settle rather than words to cover them. It was when they were almost back to the ranch, the mountain already dark against the sky, and the air finally cool after the heat of the day, that Eleanor pulled her horse alongside Caleb's and said, "Agnes Pruitt." "What about her?" he said. "We should go and see her," she said. "When this is over, when Hale has done what he's doing and Whitmore has had to answer for it. She should hear from us directly, not through a lawyer." She paused. "She should know there are people who see what happened to her." He rode beside her for a moment. "All right," he said. "And there may be others," she said. "People we don't know about yet. People who paid what they didn't owe and moved on because they didn't know they could fight it." "Hale will find them," Caleb said. "Yes," she said. "But after the court case, when people know it can be done, they might come forward themselves. They might need somewhere to bring what happened to them." She was thinking aloud now the way she did when something was forming that she didn't yet have a shape for. Some kind of, I don't know exactly what. Someone to talk to. Someone who can connect them to Hale. Caleb was quiet for a moment. "You're thinking about starting something," he said. "I'm thinking about finishing the blankets first," she said. He made a sound that might, in a man with a less strictly maintained quietness, have been a laugh. "Practical," he said. "Always," she said. They came through the gate and into the yard, and Will took the horses, and Eleanor started toward the house. She was at the back door when Caleb said her name. She turned. He was standing in the yard with his hat in his hand, and the mountain dark behind him, and he had that expression, the unguarded one, the one she had been watching come and go for weeks, the one that was almost but not quite something named. "What you did tonight," he said. "In that room, the way you walked in." "You did most of the talking," she said. "You did all of the standing," he said. "That's not nothing. That's most of it." She looked at him. The night was warm and the stars were clear, and she had spent the evening watching a room of people reconsider something they thought they knew, and she was tired in the way that came from something being nearly over, rather than from something merely being hard. "Caleb," she said. "Yeah," he said. "Thank you," she said. For all of it. The room, the order, the wire to Hale, the livery bench." She paused. "All of it." He turned his hat once in his hands. "You would have found your way," he said. "Maybe," she said, "but I was glad not to do it alone." He looked at her for a long moment. "So was I," he said quietly. "Eleanor, so was I." She went inside. She stood in the kitchen, and she put her hands on the table, which was the table where they had eaten stew, and talked about Agnes Pruitt, and read Thomas Hale's letter. And she breathed, and she thought about what it meant to be seen, not saved, not managed, not directed. Seen. By someone who had chosen to stand beside her without making it about himself, without requiring anything of her in return, without the kind of goodwill that came with a price attached. She thought about her mother, about curtains for people who looked right through you, about the work not caring who did it. She thought about mountain blue wool and a bench outside a livery, and a man turning his hat in his hands. The work was almost done. The blankets were almost finished. Whitmore was in a courtroom's future, and Agnes Pruitt had a lawyer, and Red Hollow had seen something tonight it could not unsee. And tomorrow morning the east window would let in the first light, and she would sit down at the table and put her hands on the last blanket and finish it. And that would be a thing she had done, a thing that stood solid and true, regardless of who had decided to see it. She blew out the lamp. She went to bed. For the first time in a long time she was asleep before the mountain went entirely dark. She finished the last blanket on a Sunday morning. She did not make a ceremony of it. She tied off the final stitch, ran her thumb along the border to check the tension, folded it, the way she folded all of them, edges in first then thirds, and set it on top of the completed stack. 8 blankets, 4 sets of curtains, canvas bags repaired and replaced, the full order done. She sat for a moment with her hands in her lap and looked at what she had made. Then she got up and went to find Caleb. He was at the water pump the way he often was in the early morning, and he looked up when he heard her come out. He read her face the way he read most things, quickly, accurately, without making a production of it. "Done," he said. "Done," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "How does it feel?" She thought about it honestly. "Like I want to start the next thing," she said. He almost smiled. "That sounds about right," he said. What came next arrived faster than either of them expected, and from a direction Eleanor had not entirely anticipated. Thomas Hale sent a wire on Tuesday. Short, precise, the way Hale communicated when the news was significant, and he wanted it received clearly. Judge Aldridge had reviewed the fraud filing. He had found sufficient grounds to issue a formal summons to Victor Whitmore. Proceedings were scheduled for the following month in Denver, and this was the part that made Eleanor read the wire twice. The territorial court had issued a temporary injunction freezing all of Whitmore's pending property actions in Red Hollow County, pending the outcome of the case. Caleb read it over her shoulder. "Frozen," he said. "All of them," she said. "Everything he has in motion. He can't move anything until the court rules." "How long does a case like this take?" Will said from the doorway, where he had appeared with the unerring instinct of a young man who knew when something important was happening. "Hale said a month for proceedings to open," Eleanor said. "After that—" She looked at Caleb. "He didn't say." "Hale doesn't speculate," Caleb said. "He'll know more when he's in the room with Aldridge." Eleanor set the wire down on the kitchen table. She looked at it. The injunction was not a verdict. It was not justice, not yet. But it was the sound of a door closing on something that had been running freely for 2 years, and the sound of it was significant. "Agnes Pruitt," she said. "I'll write to Hale today," Caleb said. "Ask him what the injunction means for her specifically. She needs to know it's moving," Eleanor said. "Not just through Hale. From someone she can, from someone who isn't a lawyer." He looked at her. "You want to go to Junction." "I want to go to Junction," she said. He nodded. "Thursday," he said. "Will can manage here for a day." Will from the doorway nodded with the gravity of a man accepting a significant responsibility. They rode to Junction on Thursday, and Eleanor spent most of the ride preparing herself for what she would find, because she had learned that the people who paid what they didn't owe and moved on were not always people who had recovered from the paying. Sometimes the paying was the last thing they had in them, and they had moved on, emptied out. Agnes Pruitt was not emptied out. She was 61 with white hair and careful eyes, and the particular stillness of a woman who had decided to stop waiting for things to get easier and was simply living in what was. She lived in her daughter's house, small, busy with grandchildren, the kind of house that was crowded in the way houses were crowded when love and necessity occupied the same space. She met them at the door and looked at Eleanor for a long moment before she said anything. "You're the one who found me," she said. "Thomas Hale found you," Eleanor said. "I just kept records." "Don't do that," Agnes said. Not unkindly, just firmly. "Don't make yourself smaller than what you did." Eleanor stopped. Agnes stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. "Both of you." They sat in Agnes Pruitt's daughter's parlor and drank coffee that was better than anything Eleanor had made recently, and Agnes talked about February, about the letter, the lawyer, the number she had been told she owed, the way it had been presented as so established, so settled, so already decided that she had not thought to question it. She had paid. She had left. She had told herself it was done. "I didn't know," Agnes said. "That's the thing I keep coming back to. I simply did not know that I could fight it. Nobody told me. There was nobody to tell me." Eleanor thought about her father at the kitchen table. About 3 days, and then 2 years, and then gone. "I know," she said. "I'm not a foolish woman," Agnes said. There was something fierce in it, not at Eleanor, but at the fact of it. "I ran a household for 30 years. I managed accounts. I am not foolish." "No," Eleanor said. "He relies on people not being foolish. He relies on people being busy and alone, and not knowing that the language in a legal letter doesn't mean what he wants them to think it means." She paused. "He's very careful about which of those things he picks." Agnes looked at her. "You fought him." "I had help," Eleanor said. "So did I eventually," Agnes said. "Because you kept records." She paused. "Will I get my house back?" Eleanor looked at Caleb. Caleb said, "Hale believes so. The terms of your payment were coerced through fraudulent claim. He says the court has the authority to order restitution." Agnes sat very still. Her daughter had come into the doorway, a woman of about 30, with her mother's careful eyes, and was listening without making a sound. "My house," Agnes said again, quietly. Not a question. More like someone testing the weight of words they had stopped letting themselves say. "Hale will need your formal participation in the case," Eleanor said. "He'll write to you, but yes, that's what he's working toward." Agnes looked at her coffee cup for a long moment. When she looked up, her face had changed, not dramatically, not in the way of scenes in stories, just quietly. The way faces changed when something they had stopped believing in became possible again. "Then I'll write back to Mr. Hale today," she said. They rode home in the late afternoon, and Eleanor was quiet most of the way, which Caleb understood well enough not to interrupt. When they came through the ranch gate and the mountains were going amber in the evening light, he said, "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. Then, she said, "Don't make yourself smaller than what you did." "Good advice," he said. "It's advice I give myself," she said. "I'm not always good at taking it." "Most people aren't," he said. "About their own advice." She looked at him. "Are you—" He thought about it seriously. "No," he said. She looked ahead. "What advice do you give yourself?" He was quiet for a moment. "That the right things take time," he said. "And that taking time doesn't mean they're not happening." He paused. I'm not always good at that one either. She heard something in it that she didn't immediately address. She let it settle the way she had learned to let things settle because she had learned in the weeks at this ranch that Caleb Dawson said important things plainly and without decoration, and that the best way to receive them was to give them room. What happened the following week moved with the speed of things that had been building for a long time and finally found their moment. Hale sent another wire. Whitmore had received his summons and had hired a lawyer from back east, expensive, thorough, the kind of lawyer wealthy men hired when they needed a particular kind of fight managed. Hale had expected this. He was not concerned. He said because the documentation was solid and the pattern was clear. And Judge Aldridge had already used the word systematic in his initial review, which Hale said was meaningful. 2 days after that wire, something happened that none of them had anticipated. Margaret Hargrove came to the ranch. Eleanor was in the workroom. She had started a new project, a private order from a woman in town who had found her through the reversal of the gossip that followed the church hall. Meeting the way gossip reversed when the story changed when Will appeared in the doorway with his hat already in his hands, the way he held it when he was not sure how to present information. "Mrs. Hargrove is here," he said. "She says she wants to speak to you, just you." He paused. She doesn't look the way she usually looks." Eleanor set down her work. She found Margaret Hargrove standing in the kitchen, not sitting. Standing with her hands folded in front of her, wearing an expression that Eleanor had never seen on her before. It took her a moment to identify it, because it was not an expression she associated with Margaret Hargrove. It was discomfort. Genuine, unperformed discomfort. "Mrs. Hargrove," Eleanor said. "Miss Hayes." Margaret looked around the kitchen, which was the kitchen of a working ranch, not a parlor, and which did not seem to bother her the way Eleanor might have expected. "I've come to—" She stopped, started again. "My husband signed that letter," she said. "The council letter. I did not ask him to. I did not know he was going to until after he had." She paused. "I want you to know that." Eleanor looked at her steadily. "And I want you to know," Margaret continued, "that I have told him it was wrong, what he signed his name to." She swallowed once. "And I want to say to you directly the things I said, in front of your table, about your mother." The kitchen was very quiet. "Grace Hayes worked harder than any woman I've known in this town," Margaret said. "She deserved better than what she got. And so do you." She pressed her lips together briefly. "I said what I said because you frightened me. A woman who doesn't need anyone's approval is a frightening thing to women who have built their entire lives around getting it." She met Eleanor's eyes. "That's not your problem. It was mine." Eleanor stood in the kitchen of Caleb Dawson's ranch, and she looked at Margaret Hargrove, who was not a villain. Eleanor understood now who was instead a woman who had lived inside the rules so long she had become a mechanism for enforcing them. Who had aimed herself at Eleanor because Eleanor was the thing she could not afford to be, and she felt something she had not expected to feel. Not forgiveness exactly, not yet, but the beginning of something that might become it. "Thank you for coming," Eleanor said. "It wasn't easy." "No," Margaret said. "It was not." "My mother," Eleanor said carefully, "would have been she would have understood why you came. She was better at understanding people than she had any reason to be." Margaret's composure shifted. Just barely. Just enough to see. "She was," she said quietly. "I remember." She left shortly after, and Eleanor stood in the kitchen and thought about the long chains of cause that ran from one person's action to another, from 7 blankets in the summer dust, to a church hall meeting, to Agnes Pruitt's house, to Margaret Hargrove standing in this kitchen and saying her mother's name. She thought, this is what the work is for. Not the blankets. The other work. The harder kind. The verdict from Denver came on a Wednesday 5 weeks after the proceedings opened. Hale sent a rider, not a wire this time. A rider which told Eleanor before she opened the letter that there was too much to say for a telegraph. She and Caleb sat at the kitchen table, and she read it aloud because Hale had written it to her, as well as to Caleb, which she noticed and which Hale had intended. Victor Whitmore had been found liable for systematic fraud across 7 property transactions in Red Hollow County. The court had ordered full restitution to all affected parties, including Agnes Pruitt, whose house was to be returned to her within 60 days. Whitmore's pending property acquisitions in the county were voided. His banking license was suspended pending further review by the territorial authority. Eleanor stopped reading. She looked at the paper. She read the next part quietly to herself before she read it aloud. She needed to read it to herself first. It said, "The court noted specifically the role of documentary evidence compiled by Miss Eleanor Hayes of Red Hollow, without which the systemic nature of the scheme would have been substantially more difficult to establish. Judge Aldridge asked me to convey his acknowledgement directly." She set the letter on the table. Caleb was watching her. "He did it?" Will said from the doorway. "Hale did it," Eleanor said. "And Aldridge." "And you," Caleb said. He said it without emphasis, the way he said things he had already decided were true and did not need to be argued about. "The judge said so." She looked at the letter again. Miss Eleanor Hayes of Red Hollow. Not of nowhere. Not of the edge of town. Not of the small room above Pete's building or the workroom in the mountain house. Of Red Hollow. It was a small thing. It was not a small thing at all. "I want to tell Agnes Pruitt myself," she said. "I know," Caleb said. "We'll go Saturday." Saturday came and they went, and Agnes Pruitt read Hale's summary letter at her daughter's kitchen table, and she did not cry until the 3rd paragraph, and then she cried the way certain women cried completely without apology, the way you cried when you had been not crying for a long time and had finally been given clear reason. Eleanor sat beside her and did not try to stop it or talk over it or make it more comfortable. She just sat there, which was what Agnes needed, and she knew it was what Agnes needed because she herself had needed at various times exactly that. When it was done, Agnes looked up and said, 60 days. "That's what it says," Eleanor said. "I'm going home," Agnes said. "Not to the room, just to the air in front of her. I am going home." On the ride back, Caleb said, "What's the new order?" She had told him about the private commission, the woman in town who had found her through the reversed gossip. 2 quilts and a set of curtains, she said, for her daughter's room. "Good," he said. "There's another inquiry too," she said. "A woman in Junction who heard about the Agnes Pruitt case and wants to know if I do work to order or only through referral." He glanced at her. "More than you can do alone." "Yes," she said. "I was thinking about that." She had been thinking about it for longer than she was going to say. She had been thinking about it since the night in the church hall, since Margaret Hargrove's kitchen visit, since Agnes Pruitt's face, when she understood the injunction meant her house was frozen and Whitmore could not move on it. She had been thinking about what her mother had said. The work doesn't care who does it. She had been thinking about what she wanted to do with that. "I want to talk to you about something," she said. "When we get back." He nodded once. He did not ask which was one of the things she had come to rely on without meaning to. They sat at the kitchen table that evening after supper, after Will had done the dishes with the cheerful efficiency he brought to all domestic tasks he had decided were beneath complaint, and Eleanor told Caleb what she had been thinking. A sewing cooperative. Small to start. 2 or 3 women working together in a shared space. Women who had the skill but not the capital, who could take on more work together than any of them could alone. She had thought about where. Not in town. Not initially. The rent situation in Red Hollow was complicated, and likely to remain so while Whitmore's legal aftermath settled. But there was the barn outbuilding on the west side of the ranch. She had noticed it the first week, had noticed it was solid and had a south-facing window and was large enough to hold 3 work tables. She laid it out plainly. She did not embellish. She said what she was thinking and what she was asking and what she believed could come of it. When she finished, Caleb was quiet for a moment. "You've been carrying this for a while," he said. "A few weeks," she said. "You should have told me sooner," he said. "Not an accusation. Just the observation of a man who would have liked to be told sooner." "I needed to think it through myself first," she said. I didn't want to bring you half a plan. Eleanor, he said, you could bring me half a plan. She looked at him. I know that now, she said. He was quiet again for a moment. Then, the outbuilding. You'd want to clear it. Yes. That's a week's work. I know. I'd do the planning while it's being cleared. Who are you thinking? She had 2 names. Women she knew, who she had assessed carefully, not in the calculating way, but in the way you assessed people when you were thinking about entrusting them with something you had built. She told him the names. He knew one of them. He said she was good people. I'd want it to be theirs as much as mine, Eleanor said. Not charity. A real arrangement. Shared work, shared income. She paused. I know what it is to be handed something that comes with a price. I don't want to be that. You couldn't be that if you tried, he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, Why did you buy all 7 blankets? He looked at her steadily. You know why. I want to hear you say it. He turned his coffee cup once on the table. The gesture she knew. Now the one that appeared when he was choosing his words carefully, because the words mattered. Because you were on your knees in the summer dust picking up something you'd built, he said. And everybody was watching you do it, and nobody was doing a damn thing. And because... He paused. Because the way you picked them up, you weren't broken. You were furious, and you were hiding it, and you just kept picking them up. And I thought that was someone worth knowing. The kitchen was very quiet. I didn't plan the rest of it, he said. The room, the order, any of it. I wasn't calculating. I know, she said. I kept finding reasons, he said. And then I stopped looking for reasons and started just wanting you to stay. He held her gaze. That's the honest account of it. She looked at him. She thought about borrowed ground and open things, and the specific difficulty of believing someone who deserved to be believed. She thought about not believing being safe. Caleb, she said. Yeah, he said. I'm not going anywhere, she said. He breathed. It was not a declaration dressed in romantic language. It was not a speech. It was 4 words said plainly by a woman who had learned to mean everything she said, and it landed between them with the weight of something real. Good, he said. Just that. His voice was not entirely steady. He didn't try to make it so. She looked at the kitchen table. Their kitchen table, the place where Hale had spread his papers, and Agnes Pruitt had become possible, and Margaret Hargrove had said her mother's name. And she thought about what it meant to build something with someone. Not to be saved. Not to be carried. To build. She thought about her mother, about the curtains and the mending, and the work that didn't care who did it, about the reaching that everyone had called foolishness. It had not been foolishness. It had been everything. The outbuilding was cleared in 10 days. Caleb's hands did it cheerfully, because Will had told them about the plan, and they had received it with the enthusiasm of people who like to see things happen, and had been looking for something worth doing. Joe Perkins, who had called the curtains almost civilized, built the work tables himself out of good timber, and was observed being particular about the surfaces, which Will reported with the solemnity of a young man transmitting important information. The 2 women Eleanor had named came on a Saturday to see the space. Their names were Ruth Haley, no relation to the lawyer, and Clara Ann Booth, a widow of 40, with 3 children and hands that had been sewing since she was 8 years old, and did not intend to stop. They walked the space the way Eleanor had walked it, measuring with their eyes, and they asked practical questions, and Eleanor answered them. And by the end of the afternoon, they had shaken hands over a table that Joe Perkins had made flat and true, and something had been begun. We need a name, Clara Ann said on her way out. We have time, Eleanor said. I'll think of something, Clara Ann said with the confidence of a woman who was accustomed to finding solutions, and who had already decided this was her solution to find. Ruth was quiet until the last moment, standing in the doorway, looking back at the space. Then she said, My mother used to say that the best things are built by people who needed them. She looked at Eleanor. I think that's us. Eleanor thought about 7 blankets in the summer dust, about mountain blue wool, about a bench outside a livery, and a note in plain, careful handwriting that said, If you've got something in blue or green, those will do. Yes, she said. I think that's us. The summer was ending by the time the cooperative took its first outside order. Not ending dramatically, the mountains let summer go slowly, incrementally. The mornings getting cooler before the days did the quality of the light shifting in a way you felt before you could name. Eleanor noticed it the way she noticed things now fully without the old anxious edge, the way you noticed things when you were not braced for them to be taken. She was carrying finished work to the outbuilding one morning when Caleb fell into step beside her. He did this, sometimes appeared at the edge of things she was doing, and walked alongside for a while, which she had come to recognize as its own kind of language, the language of someone who wanted to be near you without requiring anything particular of the nearness. Hale's final accounting came, he said. I know, I read it this morning. Agnes gets her house back Thursday. I know. He walked beside her. You don't seem surprised by any of it, he said. I'm not now, she said. I think I stopped being surprised somewhere around the time the outbuilding got cleaned out and Joe Perkins got particular about the tables. He almost smiled. She had come to catalog the almost smiles the way she cataloged fabric for quality, for particular character, for what they were worth. You sound like a woman who expects things to work out, he said. I sound like a woman who did the work and watched it work out, she said. That's different. Fair distinction, he said. They reached the outbuilding and she set the finished work inside, and she stood in the doorway and looked at the 3 tables and the south window and the fabric stacked against the wall, and she thought about what her mother had built from nothing, and what it had cost her, and how Eleanor had taken everything it cost and turned it into this, not to justify the cost, not to make the loss mean something. It hadn't meant, but because the reaching was the inheritance, and she was not going to waste it. Caleb, she said. Yeah, he said. He was standing just behind her, looking at the same thing. I'm going to need more wool, she said. For the winter orders. I was thinking mountain blue again. Maybe a deep green, too. I'll send Will to Junction, he said. Tell him to get twice what he thinks is enough, she said. He always underestimates. He does, Caleb agreed. She turned around and he was close, not crowding. Just close, the way 2 people were close when they had spent weeks standing beside each other at important moments and had stopped keeping unnecessary distance between them. She looked at him. I used to tell myself nobody was coming, she said. Every morning, for 3 years, like a rule I was keeping. His face was very still. I know, he said quietly. I don't say it anymore, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. All that steady, unguarded certainty of him, the man who had stepped into somebody else's fight on a summer morning and kept stepping in not because he needed to be a hero, but because some people were simply made to stand up when other people were on their knees and everyone else was watching. He reached out and took her hand, not dramatically, not with ceremony. Just took it the way you took hold of something you had been thinking about holding for a long time and had finally decided the time for thinking was done. His hand was calloused and warm, and it held hers the way he did most things, steadily, without performance, as if this was exactly where it was always going to end up, and he was simply acknowledging that fact. She held on. Outside the mountain, morning was doing what mountain mornings did, coming on clear and full and indifferent to everything small and human, and lit with the particular conviction of something that had been here long before them and intended to remain. Inside in the outbuilding on the Dawson ranch, 3 work tables stood waiting for the day's work. Ruth Haley was already on her way up the road. Clara Ann Booth would arrive by 9 with her 2 oldest children in tow, who had been assigned the task of winding thread and were taking it with more seriousness than anyone had expected. Agnes Pruitt was getting her house back Thursday. Thomas Hale was already writing to the other parties Whitmore's exposure had uncovered. Margaret Hargrove had, it was quietly said, donated a sum of money to the church fund, designated for families facing unlawful property actions, which was not an apology, and was not meant to be one, but which was something, and something was where most things worth building had to start. Eleanor Hayes stood in a doorway in the Colorado mountains on a summer morning that was already almost imperceptibly letting go of summer, and she held the hand of the man who had stepped into the dust beside her, and she was not afraid, and she was not braced, and she was not telling herself that nobody was coming. She was here. She had built something. She had stood when it was hard to stand and chosen to be open, when open was the harder thing to be. And she had found not a rescue, not a fairy story, but something realer and sturdier than either. A place, a purpose, a person beside her who had seen exactly who she was and had not asked her to be smaller or safer or more convenient. The strongest people are not the ones who never fall. They are the ones who keep standing even when nobody believes in them, even when the ground is borrowed, even when the only thing holding them up is the work and the will, and the refusal to let the reaching be for nothing. Eleanor Hayes had fallen. She had stood up. She had picked up 7 blankets in the summer dust one by one, with her hands steady and her jaw set, and she had not stopped building since.